Welcome to the still past. Write a calm, warm, and atmospheric opening narration for a sleep-friendly YouTube video. Begin with the exact phrase, "Welcome to the still past." Then gently welcome the listener and introduce tonight's journey through Homer's The Odyssey, one of the greatest epic poems of ancient Greece. Explain that tonight we will follow Odysseus on his long and uncertain journey home from the shores of Troy to Ithaca, passing through distant islands, mysterious seas, ancient gods, mythical creatures, and forgotten lands. Keep the narration slow, peaceful, soothing, and immersive, designed to help the listener relax and prepare for sleep. Avoid dramatic language, suspenseful narration, or an energetic documentary style. Make the listener feel as though they are quietly stepping into the ancient world beneath a peaceful night sky. Use simple, elegant, descriptive English. End by gently inviting the listener to settle in, relax, close their eyes, and let the journey through the world of Odysseus begin. The war was over. For 10 long years, the shores of Troy had known the sound of bronze weapons, the footsteps of soldiers, the voices of kings, and the restless movement of armies beneath the open sky. But now, at last, the great city had fallen silent. The fires that had burned through the night were beginning to fade. Along the distant walls, the first pale light of morning touched the stones, revealing the traces of a long and difficult war. Broken shields rested in the dust. Empty pathways led between quiet houses. The gates that had once guarded Troy stood open. And beyond those ancient walls, the sea waited. Far from the noise of battle, ships were gathered along the shore. Their dark wooden hulls moved gently upon the water, rising and falling with the slow rhythm of the waves. Their sails had been folded for the night, and ropes creaked softly whenever the wind passed through the harbor. The sea itself seemed almost unaware that an age had come to an end. Among those ships was the vessel of Odysseus. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had spent years far from his home. He had crossed battlefields, spoken with kings, watched friends fall, and endured the uncertainty of a war that seemed to have no ending. Now, with Troy behind him, his thoughts turned toward the small island he had left so many years before. Ithaca. The name itself seemed almost like a distant memory. He remembered green hills rising above the sea. He remembered rocky paths beneath the sun. He remembered the familiar shape of the coastline and the quiet places where he had once walked before the war had called him away. Most of all, he remembered home. The men around him were preparing the ship for departure. Quiet footsteps moved across the deck. Sailors checked ropes and supplies. Oars were placed carefully along the sides of the vessel. Water and food were brought aboard for the journey ahead. There was no celebration. Although the war had ended and Troy had fallen, the men knew that their journey home would not be simple. The sea between Troy and Ithaca was wide, and the ancient world was filled with places unknown to them. Still, the thought of returning home gave them strength. As morning slowly spread across the horizon, Odysseus stood near the shore and looked toward the sea. The eastern sky had begun to brighten. A soft line of gold appeared above the water, and the darkness of the night slowly withdrew. The waves caught the first light of dawn, becoming silver beneath the rising sun. Behind Odysseus was Troy. Ahead was the open sea. For a moment, he remained still. Perhaps he thought of everything that had happened during the war. Perhaps he thought of the men who would never see their homes again. Perhaps he thought of the years that had passed while he was away from Ithaca. But the sea did not ask him to remember. It simply moved. Wave after wave. Quietly. Endlessly. And so Odysseus turned away from the city and walked toward his ship. The sailors greeted him without ceremony. They had seen enough grand speeches during the years of war. Now they wanted only the simple comfort of movement, wind, and distance. The ropes were released. The ship began to drift away from the shore. At first, the movement was almost too gentle to notice. The oars entered the water in a slow and steady rhythm, and the ship turned toward the open sea. Troy began to grow smaller. The towers and walls that had once seemed enormous slowly became part of the distant horizon. The city that had occupied so many years of their lives was now behind them. Odysseus watched it disappear. He did not know that the journey ahead would become one of the greatest journeys ever remembered. He did not know how many shores he would visit, how many storms he would face, or how many times the sea would carry him farther from the home he desired. For now, there was only the morning. Only the ship. Only the sea. The wind gradually filled the sails. The great cloth rose above the mast and caught the breeze, and the ship began to move more quickly. The sailors adjusted the ropes, guiding the vessel toward the west. Ithaca was somewhere beyond the horizon. It could not yet be seen. But it was there. And that was enough. As the ship traveled farther from Troy, the sounds of the shore disappeared. The voices of the sailors became softer beneath the sound of the water. The rhythm of the oars settled into something almost musical. Dip. Pull. Rise. Dip. Pull. Rise. The sea seemed to breathe beneath the ship. The men began to settle into the familiar routines of travel. Some watched the sails. Others checked the ropes. A few sat quietly near the stern, looking back toward the fading coastline. The morning grew warmer. The sun climbed higher into the sky, and the surface of the Aegean shimmered with light. Odysseus stood near the front of the ship. He had spent years learning how to read the sea. He watched the movement of the clouds. He felt the direction of the wind. He listened to the sound of the water against the wooden hull. The sea was calm. For the moment. There was something peaceful in leaving the land behind. On the shore, everything was permanent. Mountains stood where they had always stood. Cities rested upon their foundations. Roads crossed the same valleys. But at sea, nothing remained still. The horizon moved with every wave. The sky seemed endless. And a traveler could look in any direction and see only blue. Odysseus knew that the sea could be dangerous. He knew that calm waters could change without warning. Yet after years of war, the openness of the sea perhaps felt almost like freedom. There were no walls here. No armies. No gates. Only wind and water. The sailors continued westward. During the afternoon, small clouds appeared in the distance. They gathered slowly, changing shape above the horizon. The wind shifted for a while, and the ship leaned gently to one side. The sailors adjusted the sails. Nothing more was needed. The journey had begun. As the sun began its slow descent, the light became softer. Gold replaced the bright white of afternoon. The sea reflected the changing colors of the sky. One by one, the men became quieter. The first day of their journey was coming to an end. Odysseus remained awake for a while longer. He looked toward the western horizon where the sun was disappearing into the sea. He wondered how many evenings would pass before he saw Ithaca again. Perhaps only a few. Perhaps many. He could not know. But in his mind, he imagined the island. He imagined its hills beneath the evening light. He imagined the familiar coastline. He imagined the sound of waves touching the shore near his home. And somewhere beyond those images was Penelope, his wife. Years had passed since he had last seen her. Their son, Telemachus, had been only a child when Odysseus left for Troy. By now, the boy would have grown. The thought made the distance between Troy and Ithaca seem even greater. Odysseus had left as a husband and father. He was returning as a man shaped by years of war and wandering. The sea continued beneath him. The ship moved steadily through the evening. Above, the first stars began to appear. At first there were only a few. Then more. The sky darkened into deep blue, and the stars became brighter. The sailors lowered some of the sails and prepared for the night. A small fire was lit carefully on the ship. Its warm glow moved gently across the wooden deck. The men ate quietly. There was bread, dried food, and water. Nothing luxurious, but after years of war, even a simple meal could feel comforting. The ship rocked beneath them. The waves made a soft sound against the hull. Some sailors spoke quietly about home. One remembered his family. Another spoke of a village near the sea. Someone else wondered what his house would look like after so many years away. Their voices rose and faded. Odysseus listened. He did not interrupt. Every man carried his own memory of home. Every man had his own Ithaca. And yet all of them were now traveling together beneath the same stars. Eventually the conversations became quieter. One sailor after another settled down to rest. The ship continued through the darkness. Odysseus stood beneath the night sky. The stars above him seemed ancient. They had watched Troy rise and fall. They had watched countless ships cross these waters. They had seen kings depart and return. They had seen sailors lose their way. And now they watched Odysseus begin his long journey home. The night was peaceful. For a moment, The world seemed to contain nothing but stars, sea, and wind. Odysseus closed his eyes. He listened. The gentle movement of the ship. The quiet creaking of wood. The soft breathing of the sea. The distant voices of sleeping men. These sounds surrounded him like a lullaby. Yet beneath the calm surface of the night, the future remained unknown. The journey had only just begun. There would be islands where strange customs were practiced. There would be shores where unfamiliar people lived. There would be caves hidden among cliffs. There would be winds that carried ships far from their intended path. There would be forests, distant temples, mysterious voices, and waters no ordinary sailor would wish to cross. There would be moments when Odysseus would come close to Ithaca, only to be carried away again. But none of that had happened yet. Tonight, the ship was simply moving west. And Ithaca remained ahead, far beyond the horizon. As the hours passed, the stars slowly turned across the sky. The moon appeared above the water, casting a pale path of light across the waves. The ship followed the wind. The men slept. The sea continued its endless movement. And somewhere between the fading memory of Troy and the distant promise of Ithaca, Odysseus began the journey that would become a story remembered for thousands of years. A story of wandering. A story of patience. A story of longing. And above all, a story of home. For no matter how far the sea carried him, Odysseus would continue to look toward the place where his journey truly belonged. Ithaca. The island waited quietly beneath the stars. And the ship sailed onward into the night. The morning came quietly upon the sea. After a night beneath the stars, the first light of dawn slowly returned to the horizon. The darkness faded from the water, and the sky changed from deep blue to pale silver, then to soft gold. The ancient ship of Odysseus continued its journey westward, carried by a gentle wind. The men were waking one by one. Some rose from their places on the deck and stretched their tired limbs. Others checked the ropes and sails, making sure that the ship remained steady upon the open water. The rhythm of the journey had already begun to feel familiar. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. Troy was far behind them now. The walls of the great city could no longer be seen, and the memories of the battlefield seemed to belong to another world. Ahead lay only the sea, the sky, and the uncertain path toward Ithaca. Odysseus watched the horizon. He had learned during the war that journeys rarely followed the path that people imagined. A man could leave one place believing that he understood where he was going, only to discover that the world had other plans. Still, Ithaca remained in his thoughts. Every morning, every evening, every quiet moment upon the sea reminded him of home. The ship sailed onward. Days passed. The sun rose and set over the water, and the sailors slowly became accustomed to the long rhythm of the voyage. They learned to sleep when the sea was calm and to remain awake when the wind changed. They shared stories during the evenings and spoke quietly about the families and villages they hoped to see again. Sometimes the sea was bright and peaceful. Sometimes clouds gathered above the horizon. Sometimes the wind became stronger, pushing the ship forward with surprising speed. But for many days, the journey continued without great difficulty. The men began to believe that perhaps the return to Ithaca would be easier than they had expected. Then, one day, the wind changed. The ship was carried away from the course Odysseus had intended. At first, the change was small. The sailors adjusted the sails and tried to guide the vessel back toward the proper direction. But the wind continued to push them across unfamiliar waters. The sea stretched endlessly around them. There were no familiar islands. No distant mountains. No known coastline. Only the horizon. Odysseus studied the sky. The sailors watched the wind. They continued forward. Eventually, after many hours of travel, the shape of land appeared in the distance. At first it was only a faint line. Then the coastline became clearer. There were low hills, quiet beaches, and stretches of green land reaching toward the sea. The sailors welcomed the sight. After so many days upon the water, even an unfamiliar shore seemed comforting. Odysseus ordered the ship toward the coast. The vessel moved through calmer water until it reached a sheltered place where the men could safely land. They stepped onto the beach. The sand was warm beneath their feet. The air smelled different from the open sea. There was something sweet and gentle in the breeze. The land seemed peaceful. No armies waited on the shore. No walls surrounded the settlement. No weapons were visible. The people who lived there appeared calm and untroubled. They were the Lotus-Eaters. The sailors who first approached them were greeted without hostility. The people of the land offered food to the strangers. Among the food were the lotus flowers and fruits for which the island was known. The sailors accepted. They had traveled a long distance. They were tired. They were hungry. And the strange sweetness of the lotus seemed harmless. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The men ate. They rested. They looked toward the quiet landscape. The sunlight moved slowly across the fields. A warm breeze passed through the grass. The sea could be heard in the distance. Everything seemed peaceful. Almost too peaceful. The sailors who had tasted the lotus began to change. Their faces became softer. Their thoughts seemed to drift away. The memories of the journey slowly became distant. The war at Troy became distant. The ship became distant. Even Ithaca began to disappear from their thoughts. The lotus did not bring pain. It did not frighten them. Instead, it brought forgetfulness. A gentle forgetting. The kind of forgetting that might seem comforting after years of hardship. The sailors no longer wished to return to the ship. They no longer wished to continue the journey. They wanted only to remain where they were. To sit beneath the warm sun. To listen to the sea. To eat the sweet fruit. To forget the long road behind them. To forget the uncertain road ahead. Odysseus soon realized that something was wrong. He found some of his men sitting quietly among the people of the land. They no longer spoke of home. They no longer spoke of their families. They no longer seemed concerned with the journey. One sailor looked at Odysseus with a peaceful expression. He told his king that there was no reason to leave. Why continue across the sea? Why return to Ithaca? Why carry the memories of war? Why endure storms and uncertainty when this quiet land offered everything they needed? Odysseus listened. He understood the temptation. After 10 years of war, the idea of forgetting everything must have seemed almost like a gift. But Odysseus remembered something the sailors had forgotten. They had not begun the journey simply to escape Troy. They had begun it to go home. And home was not only a place. It was a memory. A promise. A person waiting beyond the sea. Odysseus knew that the journey would have no meaning if they forgot where they were going. He ordered the men who had remained unaffected to bring their companions back to the ship. The sailors who had tasted the lotus resisted. They did not want to leave. They wanted to stay. Some clung to the ground. Others looked toward the peaceful fields as though they were leaving behind a paradise. Odysseus and his men carried them back to the ship. The sailors were placed aboard despite their protests. Their voices were quiet. Their eyes remained fixed upon the shore. The ship was prepared for departure. The sails were raised. The ropes were pulled tight. The oars entered the water. Slowly, the ship moved away from the land. The Lotus-Eaters remained on the shore. Their peaceful settlement became smaller and smaller. The sailors who had eaten the lotus watched until the coastline disappeared. For a long time, they said nothing. Perhaps they still dreamed of the flowers. Perhaps they still remembered the warmth of the land. Perhaps part of them wished to return. But the ship continued forward. The sea opened before them once more. Odysseus stood near the stern and watched the island disappear. He wondered about the strange power of forgetfulness. The lotus had not defeated the sailors through violence. It had not threatened them with death. It had offered them something much quieter. The chance to stop wanting. And perhaps that was why it was so dangerous. For a traveler, desire can be a burden. The desire for home can bring sadness. The desire for safety can bring fear. The desire to see loved ones again can make every mile of the journey feel longer. But without desire, there is no reason to continue. Odysseus understood that returning home required more than surviving storms and battles. It required remembering. Remembering who you were. Remembering where you belonged. Remembering the people who waited for you. The ship moved farther from the island. The afternoon slowly passed. The sailors returned to their duties. Some looked tired. Some were quiet. But gradually, the familiar rhythm of the ship returned. Ropes moved in the wind. Wood creaked beneath their feet. The sails filled gently above them. The waves touched the sides of the vessel. The sounds were ordinary. Comforting. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. There was no sign of the Lotus-Eaters now. Only open sea. The sun began to lower. The sky became pale gold. The water reflected the changing light. For a while, Odysseus simply stood there. He thought about Ithaca. He imagined the quiet coastline of his island. He imagined the evening light falling across the hills. He imagined his home waiting beyond the horizon. He wondered how many more strange places they would encounter before he could finally see it. The journey continued. Night arrived. The stars appeared above the ship. The sailors rested beneath the quiet sky. The sea moved gently around them. The island of the Lotus-Eaters became only a memory. But it had left something behind. A lesson. A reminder that not every danger in the world arrives with thunder. Some dangers come softly. Some temptations feel like comfort. Some places invite you to rest forever. And sometimes the hardest part of a journey is not surviving what lies ahead, but remembering why you began. Odysseus had begun his journey because he wanted to return home. That desire remained alive within him. The sea was still vast. The road was still uncertain. But Ithaca was still waiting. Far beyond the darkness. Far beyond the horizon. And as the ship sailed quietly through the night, the men listened to the gentle sound of the waves. The stars moved slowly above them. The wind carried the ship onward. Behind them was the land of the Lotus-Eaters. Ahead was another unknown shore. Another story. Another test. But for tonight, there was only the sea. The ship. The stars. And the quiet hope of home. The sailors settled into sleep. The wooden vessel rose and fell upon the gentle waves. Odysseus remained awake a little longer, watching the horizon beneath the moonlight. He knew that the journey would continue. He knew that the sea would ask more of them. Yet for the moment, the waters were calm. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Ithaca waited patiently. The ship sailed onward. The sea carried Odysseus and his men onward. For many days, the ship moved through waters that seemed to have no end. The island of the Lotus-Eaters had disappeared behind them, becoming only a fading memory. The sailors had learned something from that strange place. They had learned that not every danger announced itself with storms or weapons. Some dangers came quietly. Some arrived in the form of comfort. And some could make a traveler forget the very reason he had begun his journey. Now the men were more cautious. They watched the horizon carefully. They studied the shape of distant clouds. They listened to the wind. Yet the sea remained calm for a while, and the journey continued. One morning, land appeared in the distance. At first, it was little more than a dark shape beneath the sky. As the ship drew closer, the shape became clearer. There were tall mountains, steep cliffs, rocky shores, and beyond them, green valleys stretching toward the interior of the island. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship and watched the unfamiliar land. It looked wild. There were no great cities, no towers, no roads, no harbors filled with other ships. Only cliffs, forests, caves, and open fields. The sailors wondered who lived there. Perhaps no one. Perhaps the island was empty. Odysseus decided that they should explore. The ship moved toward a sheltered part of the coast. The sailors lowered the sails and guided the vessel toward the beach. When they reached the shore, they found a quiet place where the waves moved gently across the sand. The island was strangely peaceful. Birds moved through the sky. The wind passed through the grass. Far above them, clouds drifted slowly around the mountain peaks. There were signs of life. But there were no people. The sailors discovered wild goats wandering among the hills. They gathered food and explored the coastline. The island seemed rich with natural resources. There were trees bearing fruit. There were streams of fresh water. And in the distance, they noticed something that immediately caught their attention. A large cave. Its entrance was enormous. It opened into the side of a rocky mountain, surrounded by stone and shadow. Near the entrance were signs that someone lived there. Large baskets, containers, tools, and animals. Many sheep and goats wandered nearby. The sailors looked at one another. Someone clearly lived in the cave. Odysseus wondered who. His men suggested that they take some food and return to the ship. It would have been the safest choice. But Odysseus was curious. He wanted to meet the inhabitant of the cave. He wanted to know what kind of people lived upon this island. So he selected a small group of his men and entered the cave. The others remained outside. Inside, the cave was vast. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The walls were rough stone. The air was cool. The light from the entrance reached only a short distance into the interior. The sailors walked slowly. Their footsteps echoed against the walls. They found large containers filled with milk. They saw baskets of cheese. There were wooden tools and piles of firewood. Everything suggested that the inhabitant was a shepherd. But this was no ordinary shepherd's home. Everything was enormous. The baskets were large. The containers were large. Even the footprints in the earth outside the cave had been much larger than those of an ordinary man. Odysseus began to understand that they might be dealing with something unusual. Still, he remained. The sailors waited. The day passed slowly. Outside, the sun began to move toward the western horizon. Then they heard something. A distant sound. Heavy footsteps. The ground seemed to tremble beneath them. The animals outside became restless. The sailors turned toward the entrance. A shadow appeared. It grew larger. And then the creature entered. His name was Polyphemus. He was a cyclops. A giant shepherd with a single eye in the center of his forehead. He carried enormous pieces of wood and moved with the slow strength of someone accustomed to living alone among the mountains. When he saw the strangers inside his cave, he stopped. The sailors became silent. Polyphemus looked at them. His single eye moved slowly across the group. He wanted to know who they were. Odysseus stepped forward. He spoke respectfully. He explained that they were travelers returning from the war at Troy. He asked Polyphemus to offer them the hospitality traditionally given to strangers. But Polyphemus did not respond as Odysseus had hoped. He was not impressed by the customs of distant kings. He did not fear the gods of the Greeks. He simply looked at the sailors as though they were small and unfamiliar creatures who had wandered into his home. Then he closed the entrance of the cave. The stone he used was enormous. The sailors watched in silence. It was impossible for ordinary men to move it. They were trapped. Night fell outside. The cave became dark. Polyphemus prepared his meal. The sailors understood that they had made a terrible mistake by entering the cave. Odysseus remained calm. He knew that fear would not help them. He studied the cave. He studied the Cyclops. He studied the enormous stone blocking the entrance. Somewhere inside his mind, he began searching for a way out. The night passed slowly. The next morning, Polyphemus moved the stone aside and led his sheep outside. Then he replaced the stone. The sailors were trapped again. Odysseus watched carefully. He noticed something important. The Cyclops cared deeply for his animals. Every morning, he counted them. Every evening, he brought them back into the cave. This gave Odysseus an idea. But first, he needed time. He had brought wine with him from the ship. It was strong and richly flavored. He offered it to Polyphemus. The Cyclops had never tasted wine like it. He drank. Then he asked Odysseus for his name. Odysseus did not give his real name. Instead, he told the Cyclops that his name was Nobody. Polyphemus laughed. He continued drinking. The wine made him tired. The great Cyclops slowly became less alert. Eventually, he fell into a deep sleep. The sailors waited. Odysseus and his men had prepared a large wooden stake. They sharpened it carefully. When the moment came, they heated the end of the stake in the fire. Then, together, they drove it toward the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus awoke in pain. His voice shook the cave. The sailors stepped back. The Cyclops cried out for help. Other Cyclopes heard him outside. They called to him. They asked who was attacking him. Polyphemus shouted that nobody was hurting him. The others thought he meant that no one was attacking him. So they did not come. They left him alone. Inside the cave, Odysseus understood that his plan had worked. But the danger was not over. The stone still blocked the entrance. Polyphemus was blind but still incredibly strong. Odysseus needed another way to escape. He remembered the sheep. The next morning, Polyphemus moved the stone aside. He sat near the entrance. He touched each animal as it passed. He wanted to make sure that the Greeks could not escape. But Odysseus had another plan. The sailors tied themselves beneath the largest sheep. When Polyphemus felt the animals passing, he touched only their backs. He did not realize that the men were beneath them. Slowly, the sheep left the cave. One by one. Quietly. Patiently. Odysseus and his men escaped. When they reached the outside, they hurried toward the shore. They returned to their ship. But first, he needed time. He had brought wine with him from the ship. It was strong and richly flavored. The sailors pushed the vessel into the water. They climbed aboard. They raised the sails. And soon the ship was moving away from the island. Polyphemus stood upon the shore. He could hear the ship leaving. He could not see it. He shouted toward the sea. His voice echoed among the cliffs. Odysseus had escaped. But he had made a mistake. As the ship moved farther away, he called back toward the island. He wanted Polyphemus to know who had defeated him. He revealed his true name. Odysseus. The Cyclops remembered the name. And Polyphemus called upon his father, Poseidon, god of the sea. He asked that Odysseus be prevented from reaching Ithaca quickly. The sea became the place where the consequences of this encounter would unfold. The sailors continued their journey. The island grew smaller behind them. The cliffs faded into the distance. The cave disappeared from sight. The men were alive. They had escaped. Yet the sea ahead no longer seemed quite as peaceful. Odysseus stood quietly on the deck. He looked back toward the island. Perhaps he wondered whether he should have remained silent. Perhaps he understood that pride could be dangerous. The journey home required more than courage. It required patience. It required knowing when to speak and when to remain quiet. The sea stretched endlessly before them. The wind filled the sails. The ship moved onward. Behind them was the cave of Polyphemus. Ahead lay the unknown. The sailors settled into their familiar work. The waves continued to rise and fall. The sun moved slowly across the sky. And as evening approached, the island disappeared completely. Only the memory remained. A dark cave. A single enormous eye. A giant voice echoing among the rocks. And a narrow escape beneath the bodies of sheep. The sailors were grateful to be free. They rested beneath the evening sky. The sea was calm once more. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the god of the sea had heard the prayer of Polyphemus. Odysseus did not yet know how much that prayer would shape the journey ahead. For now, he could only continue. Westward. Toward Ithaca. Toward home. The stars appeared one by one. The sailors became quiet. The wooden ship moved gently through the dark water. And the story of their journey continued beneath the endless night sky. The ship sailed away from the island of the Cyclops. Behind Odysseus and his men, the rocky coastline slowly disappeared into the distance. The mountains became smaller, the cliffs faded into the haze, and eventually there was nothing left to see but the endless blue of the sea. For a while, no one spoke much. The sailors were tired. They had escaped from the cave of Polyphemus, but the memory of that place remained fresh in their minds. They remembered the enormous cave, the great stone at its entrance, and the single eye of the Cyclops watching them from the darkness. Yet they were alive. And they were moving toward home. The ship continued across the sea. The wind was gentle at first. It filled the sails and carried the vessel steadily forward. The sailors returned to their ordinary duties. Ropes were checked, sails were adjusted, and food was prepared for the days ahead. Odysseus watched the horizon. He knew that the journey would continue to test them. But after what had happened with Polyphemus, he hoped that perhaps the worst was behind them. He was wrong. The sea carried them onward for many days. Sometimes the weather was clear. Sometimes clouds gathered above the horizon and disappeared again. The sailors became accustomed to the rhythm of the sea once more. Morning, afternoon, evening, night. The same endless cycle repeated itself. During the evenings, they spoke about Ithaca. Some imagined the moment when they would finally step onto their home shores. Others imagined the food waiting for them. Some thought of their families. Odysseus thought of Penelope and Telemachus. He wondered how much they had changed. He wondered whether his son still remembered the sound of his father's voice. These thoughts kept him moving. One morning, a strange island appeared ahead. It seemed almost to float upon the sea. Its shores were green and peaceful, and the hills rose gently toward the sky. Unlike the rocky island of the Cyclops, this place seemed welcoming. The sailors approached carefully. As they came closer, they noticed something unusual. The island was surrounded by high cliffs, but inside those cliffs was a beautiful valley filled with trees and green grass. At the center of the island stood a magnificent palace. Its walls seemed to shine beneath the sunlight. Odysseus ordered the sailors to bring the ship toward the shore. They had reached the home of Aeolus. Aeolus was known as the keeper of the winds. He lived upon the island with his family, surrounded by the forces of the sky and sea. When Odysseus arrived, Aeolus welcomed him. The two men spoke for a long time. Odysseus told him about the fall of Troy. He spoke of the journey that had followed. He told him about the Lotus-Eaters. He told him about Polyphemus. He told him about the many days spent wandering across unfamiliar waters. Aeolus listened. He understood the difficulty of the journey. For a month, Odysseus and his men remained upon the island. It was a time of rest. After so much uncertainty, the peaceful island seemed almost like a gift. The sailors ate well. They slept. They repaired their clothing and equipment. They walked through the green valleys. They watched the clouds move slowly across the sky. The island was filled with strange and beautiful sounds. The wind moved through the trees. Birds called from distant branches. The sea touched the shore in a slow and steady rhythm. For the first time in many days, there was little reason to hurry. Odysseus enjoyed the rest. But he never forgot Ithaca. Even while sitting in the peaceful palace of Aeolus, his thoughts returned to home. After a month, he decided that it was time to leave. Aeolus understood. Before Odysseus departed, the keeper of the winds offered him a remarkable gift. He gathered the powerful winds and placed them inside a great leather bag. Only the gentle wind that could carry Odysseus toward Ithaca was allowed to remain outside. The other winds were trapped within the bag. Aeolus gave it to Odysseus. He warned him to guard it carefully. The sailors loaded the gift aboard the ship. Then they prepared to leave. The island slowly disappeared behind them. The wind carried the ship westward. For 9 days and 9 nights, the journey went remarkably well. The sailors could hardly believe their good fortune. The sea remained calm. The wind stayed steady. The ship moved quickly toward Ithaca. Every morning, Odysseus watched the horizon. Every evening, he imagined that perhaps the next sunrise would reveal the familiar hills of his homeland. The sailors became excited. They began to believe that their journey was finally coming to an end. Then, on the 10th day, something appeared on the horizon. A dark shape. At first, no one knew what it was. Odysseus looked carefully. His heart began to beat faster. It was land. Ithaca. After so many years, the island of his home was finally within reach. The sailors celebrated quietly. Some raised their arms. Others smiled. A few began to speak about their families. They had almost arrived. Odysseus was exhausted. He had spent many days and nights awake, watching the sea and guiding the journey. Now that Ithaca was close, he finally allowed himself to rest. He lay down upon the deck. The sound of the sea surrounded him. The wind moved gently through the sails. He closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, Odysseus slept deeply. The sailors continued their work. They watched the horizon. They could see Ithaca growing closer. But they did not understand the importance of the leather bag. They had seen Aeolus give it to Odysseus. They knew it contained something mysterious. But they did not know exactly what was inside. As Odysseus slept, the sailors began to wonder. They looked at the island in the distance. They looked at their king. They looked at the leather bag. Some believed that Aeolus must have given Odysseus treasures. Perhaps gold. Perhaps silver. Perhaps gifts meant only for the king. The sailors became curious. Then curiosity became suspicion. They began to wonder whether Odysseus had secretly received riches while keeping them for himself. The thought spread quietly through the crew. No one wanted to ask Odysseus directly. Instead, they watched the bag. Eventually, one sailor reached toward it. Another followed. They opened the leather bag. The winds escaped. Suddenly, the peaceful air changed. The sky darkened. The sea rose. Powerful winds burst outward in every direction. The ship was thrown into confusion. Sails snapped. Ropes moved wildly across the deck. The waves grew higher. The sailors struggled to control the ship. Odysseus woke suddenly. He looked toward the sea. The island of Ithaca was disappearing. The wind was carrying them away. For a moment, he could hardly understand what had happened. Then he saw the open bag. He understood. Their journey had been undone by a single moment of carelessness. The ship was carried farther and farther from Ithaca. The sailors tried to fight the wind. But the winds were too powerful. The sea seemed to stretch endlessly around them. The island that had been so close disappeared behind clouds and mist. Odysseus stood silently. He had been so close. After years of war and wandering, Ithaca had finally appeared before him. And now it was gone. The ship drifted for many days. Eventually, the winds weakened. The sea became calmer. The sailors were exhausted. They had lost their course. Once again, they had no idea where they were. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. He could not see Ithaca. He could not see the island of Aeolus. He could see nothing familiar. The sailors were ashamed. Some avoided looking at their king. They understood what they had done. But regret could not change the wind. Eventually, the ship returned to the island of Aeolus. The sailors hoped that Aeolus would help them again. They approached the shore. Odysseus went to speak with the keeper of the winds. He explained what had happened. Aeolus listened carefully. At first, he seemed surprised. Then he became quiet. Finally, he told Odysseus that he could not help him. The gods must have turned against him, Aeolus believed. Perhaps a man who was continually carried away from home was not yet meant to return. Odysseus could not change his mind. There was nothing more to say. The ship left the island once again. The sailors were silent. The sea stretched before them. The journey had begun again. Yet something had changed. They had learned how fragile their progress could be. 9 days of successful travel had brought them almost home. One careless action had taken it all away. The sea did not care how close they had been. The wind did not care how much they had suffered. Nature moved according to its own rhythms. The sailors would have to continue. Odysseus returned to his place near the front of the ship. He looked toward the horizon. There was sadness in his heart. But there was also determination. He would not give up. Ithaca was still somewhere in the world. His home still existed. Penelope was still waiting. Telemachus was still there. And the journey, no matter how long it became, was not yet finished. Night came. The sailors rested beneath a quiet sky. The winds had finally settled. The sea became smooth again. The moon appeared between the clouds. Its pale light moved across the water. The ship rose gently upon the waves. Odysseus remained awake. He thought about the strange power of the wind. A breeze could carry a ship toward home. The same breeze could carry it away. The wind could be a friend. The wind could be an enemy. And sometimes, like the journey itself, it could not be controlled. Odysseus listened to the quiet sound of the sails. The ship moved slowly through the darkness. Behind them was the island of Aeolus. Far behind that was the land of the Cyclops. Even farther away were the shores of the Lotus-Eaters and the ruins of Troy. Ahead lay another unknown chapter. The sailors did not know what awaited them. But they knew they had to continue. The night became deeper. The stars filled the sky. The sea reflected their light. And the ship sailed onward. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Ithaca remained. It had been seen once. It could be seen again. For now, Odysseus could only trust the sea, the stars, and the road ahead. The winds had carried him away from home. But they had not erased the memory of home. And as the ship moved quietly beneath the stars, that memory remained like a small light in the darkness. A light that continued to guide him. A light called Ithaca. The ship sailed onward. After leaving the island of Aeolus, Odysseus and his men once again found themselves upon the open sea. The winds no longer carried them toward Ithaca. Instead, they were forced to continue through unfamiliar waters, following whatever course the sea allowed. The sailors were tired. They had already traveled so far. They had seen the shores of the Lotus-Eaters, escaped from the cave of Polyphemus, and come close enough to Ithaca to see its distant hills. Then, in a single moment, the winds had taken everything away. Still, they continued. There was no other choice. The sea stretched endlessly around them, and the horizon remained empty. For several days, the weather was calm. The sun rose each morning above the water, and the sailors worked quietly upon the deck. At night, they watched the stars and listened to the gentle movement of the waves. Odysseus often stood alone near the front of the ship. He thought about home. He thought about the journey. And he wondered how much longer the sea would keep him away from Ithaca. Yet he knew that the journey was not finished. One morning, after many days of sailing, a strange coastline appeared in the distance. At first, it seemed like a low line of green beneath the sky. As the ship approached, the land became clearer. There were thick forests, tall trees, quiet beaches, and mountains rising gently behind the shore. The island looked peaceful. Birds flew above the trees. A soft mist rested among the distant hills. The sea around the island was unusually calm. The sailors watched carefully. They had learned not to trust beautiful places too quickly. Still, they needed food and fresh water. Odysseus decided that they should approach the island. The ship entered a quiet bay. The sailors lowered the sails and guided the vessel toward the shore. They found a safe place to anchor. For a while, no one moved. They listened to the island. The sound of birds. The rustling of leaves. The distant movement of water. Everything seemed peaceful. Odysseus chose several men to explore. They walked into the forest. The trees were tall and ancient. Sunlight passed through the leaves in narrow golden beams. Flowers grew beside the paths. Small animals moved quietly through the undergrowth. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. There were no signs of villages. No farms. No roads. Yet the men could hear something in the distance. Music. It was faint at first. A soft melody carried through the trees. The sailors followed the sound. Eventually, they reached a beautiful clearing. In the center stood a magnificent house. Its walls were made of stone. Vines climbed around its entrance. Smoke rose gently from the roof. Around the house were many animals. Wolves, lions, and other creatures of the forest. But they did not behave like wild animals. They were strangely calm. They moved quietly around the house. The sailors were uncertain. They stood at the edge of the clearing. Then the door opened. A woman appeared. Her name was Circe. She was a powerful enchantress who lived alone upon the island. Circe welcomed the sailors into her home. She offered them food and drink. The men were exhausted from their long journey. They accepted. They did not know that the drink contained magic. One by one, the sailors began to change. Their bodies transformed. The enchantment turned them into pigs. The men who remained outside were terrified. They ran back toward the ship. When they reached Odysseus, they could barely speak. They told him what had happened. Odysseus listened carefully. Then he took his sword and prepared to return to Circe's house. The rustling of leaves. The distant movement of water. Everything seemed peaceful. Odysseus chose several men to explore. They walked into the forest. The trees were tall and ancient. He knew that he could not leave his men behind. As he walked through the forest, something unexpected happened. A god appeared before him. It was Hermes. Hermes warned Odysseus about Circe's magic. He gave him a special herb called moly. The herb would protect him from Circe's enchantment. Hermes explained what Odysseus should do. He should accept the drink. He should not be afraid. And when Circe attempted to use her magic, he should draw his sword. Odysseus continued toward the house. The forest was quiet around him. The animals watched him as he passed. The wolves and lions did not attack. They simply followed him with their eyes. Soon he reached the clearing. Circe opened the door. She recognized him as a stranger. She welcomed him inside. Odysseus entered. Circe prepared the same drink she had given his men. She handed him the cup. Odysseus drank. He felt the magic enter his body. But nothing happened. The herb of Hermes had protected him. Circe stared at him. She understood that he was not an ordinary traveler. Odysseus drew his sword. For the first time, Circe seemed uncertain. She realized that her magic could not control him. Odysseus told her that his men must be returned. Circe agreed. She released the enchantment. The sailors returned to their human forms. They were weak and confused, but they were alive. Odysseus had rescued them. The danger was over. But something unexpected followed. Circe no longer treated Odysseus as an enemy. Instead, she offered him hospitality. She invited him and his men to remain upon the island. They accepted. The journey had exhausted them. For a while, they needed rest. And Circe's island offered everything they needed. There was food, fresh water, warm shelter, quiet forests, and a beautiful coastline. Days passed. Then weeks. The sailors began to recover. They repaired their clothing. They repaired their weapons and equipment. They explored the island. Some spent their days near the shore. Others walked through the forest. The animals around Circe's house remained peaceful. The island seemed almost separated from the rest of the world. Time moved differently there. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. The moon rose. Then another morning came. Odysseus had intended to stay only for a short time. But the island was comfortable. The men were tired. And after everything they had experienced, perhaps they needed somewhere to rest. One day became many. Many days became months. Eventually, an entire year passed. Odysseus and his men remained on Circe's island. During this time, Odysseus learned more about the strange woman who lived there. Circe knew many secrets of the natural world. She understood herbs and plants. She knew the movements of the stars. She understood the winds and the changing seasons. Her house was filled with strange objects and beautiful vessels. At night, she sometimes spoke about distant lands. She told stories of gods and heroes. The sailors listened quietly. The island became a place of stories. Outside, the forest moved gently in the wind. Inside, lamps burned softly. The men ate together. They spoke about the journey. They remembered Troy. They remembered the Lotus-Eaters. They remembered Polyphemus. And they remembered the moment when Ithaca had appeared on the horizon. That memory remained painful. They had been so close. Yet now, they were far away again. Odysseus never forgot his home. Even during the peaceful months on Circe's island, Ithaca remained in his thoughts. Sometimes he walked alone along the shore. He watched the waves. He wondered where the winds were carrying ships across the sea. He imagined his wife waiting. He imagined his son growing older. The island could offer comfort, but it could not replace home. Eventually, the time came when Odysseus knew that he had to leave. He gathered his men. He told them that their journey must continue. They were surprised. Some had grown comfortable on the island. Others were simply tired of wandering. But they understood. They had begun the journey to return home. And no peaceful island could change that. Circe did not try to stop them. Instead, she told Odysseus that another part of the journey awaited him. Before he could safely continue toward Ithaca, he would have to travel to the land of the dead. He would need to seek the guidance of the prophet Tiresias. The journey would take him to the edge of the underworld. The sailors listened carefully. The thought of visiting the world beneath the earth filled them with uncertainty. Yet Odysseus understood that there was no other path. The island had been a place of rest. Now it was time to leave. The ship was prepared. Food and water were loaded. The sails were repaired. The ropes were checked. The men gathered on the shore. For the last time, Odysseus looked toward Circe's house. The animals remained quietly among the trees. The forest moved in the morning breeze. The island was peaceful. It would have been easy to remain. But the journey home was still waiting. The sailors boarded the ship. The ropes were released. The vessel moved away from the shore. Circe stood upon the beach and watched them depart. The island slowly became smaller. The forest faded into the distance. The mountains disappeared behind the horizon. Odysseus looked back one final time. Then he turned toward the sea. The journey continued. The afternoon passed quietly. The sailors settled into their familiar routines. The ship moved beneath a clear sky. Yet the mood was different now. They knew that their next destination would not be an ordinary island. They were traveling toward the underworld. Toward a place no living sailor visited willingly. The sun began to set. The sky became golden. The sea reflected the fading light. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship. He thought about everything that had happened. Troy. The Lotus-Eaters. Polyphemus. Aeolus. Ithaca. Circe. Each place had taken him farther from home. And yet each place had also taught him something. The journey was not simply about distance. It was about endurance. About memory. About the strange ways in which a person could become lost and still continue searching for the way home. Night arrived. The stars appeared above the ship. The sailors rested. The sea was calm. Odysseus remained awake. He looked toward the darkness ahead. Somewhere beyond the horizon waited the land of the dead. The wind moved softly through the sails. The ship continued forward. Behind them, Circe's island disappeared into the night. Ahead was another world. A world of shadows, memories, and ancient voices. But for now, there was only the quiet sea, the gentle movement of the ship, the stars above, and the distant promise of Ithaca. Odysseus closed his eyes for a moment. He listened to the water. He listened to the wind. And he allowed himself to remember home. Then, beneath the peaceful night sky, the ship sailed onward toward the next chapter of his long journey. The ship sailed into the darkness. Behind Odysseus and his men, the island of Circe had already disappeared beyond the horizon. Its green forests, quiet beaches, and mysterious house were now only memories. Ahead lay a different kind of journey. Circe had told Odysseus that he could not simply continue toward Ithaca. Before he could find the right path home, he would have to seek the wisdom of the dead. He would have to travel to the edge of the underworld. The sailors had listened in silence when Circe explained what awaited them. The underworld was not a place where living men traveled. It belonged to the shadows of those who had already left the world of the living. Yet Odysseus had no choice. If he wished to return home, he needed the guidance of Tiresias, the ancient prophet whose spirit remained beyond death. So the ship continued onward. The sea was calm that night. The stars appeared above the dark water, one after another, until the entire sky seemed filled with distant lights. The sailors spoke very little. They had traveled through many strange lands, but this destination was different. There was something unsettling about knowing that their next journey would take them toward the world of the dead. Still, the night itself remained peaceful. The wooden ship moved slowly through the water. The sails caught the gentle wind. The waves touched the hull with a soft, repetitive sound. Odysseus stood near the front of the ship. He looked toward the darkness ahead. He thought about all the people he had known who were no longer alive. Friends from Troy. Warriors who had fought beside him. Men whose voices he could still remember. Perhaps some of them waited somewhere beyond the boundary of the living world. Perhaps he would see them again. The thought made him quiet. After many hours of sailing, the landscape around them began to change. The familiar blue of the Mediterranean seemed to disappear. The water became darker beneath the night sky. The wind grew colder. The stars appeared more distant. Far ahead, dark mountains rose from the horizon. The sailors watched them carefully. They knew that they were approaching the place Circe had described. The ship continued toward the distant shore. There were no bright cities. No houses. No welcoming harbor. Only cliffs, shadows, and a strange stillness that seemed to cover the land. Eventually, the ship reached the coast. Odysseus and his men stepped onto the shore. The ground beneath their feet was dark and cold. They carried the things Circe had told them to bring. They walked inland. The path led them toward a place where the world seemed to become quieter with every step. There were no birds singing. No animals moved through the trees. Even the wind seemed to have lost its strength. The sailors followed Odysseus carefully. They passed between dark rocks and narrow valleys. Eventually, they reached a deep and shadowy place. This was the boundary of the underworld. Odysseus stopped. For a moment, none of the men moved. The world around them seemed almost still. There was a feeling that they had reached a place where ordinary rules no longer mattered. Odysseus prepared the ritual that Circe had described. He dug a small trench in the earth. He poured offerings into it. He offered milk and honey, then wine, then water. He scattered barley over the ground. The sailor stood quietly behind him. The ritual was not a battle. There were no weapons. There was no army. There was only silence. Odysseus called upon the dead. He asked the spirits to come near. At first, nothing happened. The darkness remained. The wind moved softly through the distant rocks. Then something changed. A faint movement appeared in the shadows. Another. Then another. The dead began to gather. They came from the darkness like figures emerging from a distant dream. They were not solid like living people. They seemed pale and uncertain, almost like shadows beneath the moon. Odysseus watched them approach. The sailors stepped backward. They were frightened. But Odysseus remained where he was. He had come for knowledge. He would not turn away. Among the spirits, he saw faces he remembered. Men from the war. Men who had once stood beside him beneath the walls of Troy. Now they were only memories given shape. One of the first spirits Odysseus recognized was Elpenor. Elpenor had been one of his companions. He had died upon Circe's island. His death had been sudden and unfortunate. Odysseus was surprised to see him among the dead. Elpenor spoke. He asked Odysseus not to forget him. He asked that his body be given the proper funeral rites when they returned to Circe's island. Odysseus promised. Even in the world of shadows, Elpenor's concern was simple. He wanted to be remembered. Odysseus understood. The living might travel far. They might cross seas and mountains. They might become famous. But the dead had only memory. To be remembered was to remain connected to the world they had left. Odysseus waited. More spirits gathered. Then he saw someone he had not expected. His mother. Anticly. She had died while he was away from Ithaca. Odysseus had not known that he would find her here. For a moment, he could not speak. He remembered her as she had been when he was a child. He remembered her voice. Her kindness. The familiar feeling of being near someone who had known him before he became a king or a warrior. Now she stood before him as a spirit. Odysseus wanted to embrace her. But he could not. The dead could not be held like the living. He reached toward her, but she seemed to slip away like smoke. He tried again. Again, his hands passed through her. His mother explained that the dead no longer possessed the bodies they once had. They were only spirits. Memories. They were not solid like living people. They seemed pale and uncertain, almost like shadows beneath the moon. Odysseus watched them approach. The sailors stepped backward. They were frightened. But Odysseus remained where he was. He had come for knowledge. He would not turn away. Among the spirits, he saw faces he remembered. Men from the war. Men who had once stood beside him beneath the walls of Troy. Now they were only memories given shape. One of the first spirits Odysseus recognized was Elpenor. Elpenor had been one of his companions. He had died upon Circe's island. His death had been sudden and unfortunate. Odysseus was surprised to see him among the dead. Elpenor spoke. He asked Odysseus not to forget him. He asked that his body be given the proper funeral rites when they returned to Circe's island. Odysseus promised. Even in the world of shadows, Elpenor's concern was simple. He wanted to be remembered. Odysseus understood. The living might travel far. They might cross seas and mountains. They might become famous. But the dead had only memory. To be remembered was to remain connected to the world they had left. Odysseus waited. More spirits gathered. Then he saw someone he had not expected. His mother. Anticly. She had died while he was away from Ithaca. Odysseus had not known that he would find her here. For a moment, he could not speak. He remembered her as she had been when he was a child. He remembered her voice. Her kindness. The familiar feeling of being near someone who had known him before he became a king or a warrior. Now she stood before him as a spirit. Odysseus wanted to embrace her. But he could not. The dead could not be held like the living. He reached toward her, but she seemed to slip away like smoke. He tried again. Again, his hands passed through her. His mother explained that the dead no longer possessed the bodies they once had. They were only spirits. Memories. Shadows of the people they had been. Odysseus asked her about Ithaca. He wanted to know whether Penelope was safe. He wanted to know about Telemachus. His mother told him that Penelope continued to wait. His son had grown. His home remained. The news gave Odysseus both comfort and sadness. His mother had waited for him. And he had not been there. He realized how much time had passed. Years. Years that could never be recovered. The underworld seemed to make time feel different. The living measured their lives by days and seasons. The dead seemed to exist outside those measurements. Odysseus stood quietly before his mother. He wished he could remain with her. But he knew that he could not. His journey belonged to the living. He had to return. Then the spirit of Tiresias appeared. The prophet approached from among the shadows. Odysseus stepped forward. He asked Tiresias to tell him what awaited him. Tiresias spoke of the journey ahead. He warned Odysseus that the road home would remain difficult. The sea would continue to test him. The gods would continue to influence his path. There would be another island. There would be another temptation. There would be dangers that Odysseus could not overcome through strength alone. Tiresias also warned him about the island of the sun. There, sacred cattle belonged to Aeolus. The men must not harm them. If they did, disaster would follow. Odysseus listened carefully. He understood that the warning was important. Yet even with knowledge, the future could not be controlled completely. A traveler could know where danger waited and still find himself drawn toward it. Tiresias also spoke of Ithaca. Odysseus would return. But his arrival would not be simple. He would find trouble in his own home. Men would be occupying his halls. They would consume his food. They would seek the hand of Penelope. Odysseus would have to be patient. He would have to hide his identity. He would have to wait for the right moment. The prophecy filled Odysseus with both hope and uncertainty. At least Ithaca remained possible. At least the road home had not been closed. The spirit of Tiresias slowly faded into the darkness. Odysseus remained still. Around him, the spirits continued to gather. He saw more familiar faces. Heroes. Kings. Warriors. Men who had once been powerful upon the earth. Now they were all equal beneath the shadows. Odysseus saw Achilles, the great warrior of Troy. During life, Achilles had been celebrated as one of the greatest heroes of his age. His name had been spoken with admiration. His strength had been feared. His courage had been remembered. But in the underworld, Achilles spoke differently. He told Odysseus that he would rather live as a poor man upon the earth than rule over all the dead. Odysseus understood the meaning. Life was precious because it could still change. The living could return home. The living could see the sunrise. The living could touch the sea. The living could hear the voices of their loved ones. The dead had none of these things. The underworld was not a kingdom of glory. It was a place of memory. Odysseus looked around him. The spirits moved like shadows. Some seemed lost. Some seemed peaceful. Some seemed to remember the world above. He thought about Ithaca. He thought about the sunlight there. The green hills. The sea. His home. For the first time, he understood that returning home was not simply about reaching a particular island. It was about returning to life. Returning to the people he loved. Returning to the world where the sun rose each morning. Odysseus knew it was time to leave. The longer he remained among the dead, the heavier the darkness seemed to become. He gathered his men. They began the journey back toward the shore. The spirits slowly disappeared behind them. The voices became quieter. The shadows faded. Eventually, the world of the living returned. The air felt different. The wind seemed warmer. The sea looked brighter. Odysseus turned toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise. A pale light appeared across the water. Morning was coming. The sailors stood quietly beside their ship. They had survived the journey to the edge of the underworld. Now they were returning to the sea. Odysseus looked back one final time. The dark land was fading beneath the early light. The spirits were no longer visible. The underworld remained behind them. But its lessons would stay with Odysseus. He had learned that life was fragile. He had learned that memory could be more powerful than distance. He had learned that even the greatest heroes eventually became shadows. And he had learned something else. Home was not something to take for granted. It was something to remember. Something to protect. Something to return to. The sailors pushed the ship into the water. The ropes were released. The sails rose slowly above the mast. The morning wind filled them. The ship moved away from the shore. The sea opened before them. Odysseus stood at the front of the vessel. The sun rose higher. Its light spread across the water. After the darkness of the underworld, the brightness seemed almost overwhelming. The sailors watched the horizon. They were quiet. Perhaps they were thinking about the dead they had seen. Perhaps they were thinking about their own homes. Perhaps they were simply grateful to be alive. The ship continued onward. Behind them lay the land of shadows. Ahead waited another uncertain chapter. Odysseus knew that Teiresias's warnings would remain in his mind. He knew that the road ahead would bring new dangers. But he also knew that Ithaca was still waiting. Somewhere beyond the horizon. The journey was not over. The sea was wide. The wind was changing. And the ship moved slowly toward the next horizon. As evening approached, the sailors rested. The stars appeared once again. Odysseus looked upward. The same stars had watched him leave Troy. They had watched him cross strange seas. They had watched him enter the world of the dead. Now they watched him continue. Perhaps that was the comfort of the stars. They remained. While men traveled, fought, loved, lost, and returned, the stars continued their quiet paths across the sky. Odysseus listened to the waves. The wooden ship rose and fell gently beneath him. The darkness around the vessel was no longer frightening. He had seen a deeper darkness. He had walked among the dead. Now he was alive. And he was still traveling home. The ship sailed into the night. Behind it, the underworld disappeared into memory. Ahead, the sea waited. And somewhere beyond that endless sea, beyond the islands and storms and distant shores, there was a small island beneath the sun. Ithaca. Home. The place Odysseus had never stopped remembering. The ship continued across the sea. The darkness of the underworld was now behind Odysseus and his men. The pale shores had disappeared. The spirits had faded into memory. And once again, the sailors found themselves beneath the open sky. The morning after their return from the underworld was quiet. The sea was calm. A soft wind filled the sails. The sun rose slowly above the horizon, spreading golden light across the water. For a while, no one spoke. The men were still thinking about what they had seen. The underworld had changed something inside them. They had seen the dead. They had heard the voices of people who had once lived beside them. They had learned that even the greatest heroes eventually became memories. Now they were alive. And they were still traveling toward home. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship. He remembered the warnings of Tiresias. He remembered the advice of Circe. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be dangers waiting for them. Among them were the Sirens. Odysseus had heard stories about these mysterious creatures. They lived upon an island surrounded by dangerous waters. Their voices were beautiful. So beautiful that sailors who heard them could forget everything else. They would forget their homes. They would forget their families. They would forget their journey. They would want only to hear the song again. Ships that approached too closely would never leave. The sailors would remain near the island until their ships were destroyed. Circe had warned Odysseus carefully. There was only one safe way to pass. The ears of the sailors had to be filled with wax. They would not hear the song. But Odysseus wanted to hear it. He wanted to know what made the sirens' voices so powerful. So he developed a plan. He ordered his sailors to soften pieces of beeswax. Then they pressed the wax into their ears. Once the sailors could no longer hear the world around them, Odysseus gave them another. They were to tie him tightly to the mast. No matter what he said. No matter what he ordered. No matter how desperately he begged. They must not release him until the ship had passed beyond the sirens. The sailors agreed. They tied strong ropes around Odysseus. They secured him to the wooden mast. Then the ship continued forward. The sea remained calm. The sky was bright. There seemed to be nothing dangerous ahead. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the sirens were waiting. The sailors could not hear them. Odysseus could. At first, there was only a faint sound. A distant melody carried across the water. It was almost impossible to recognize. The sailors continued rowing. The ship moved closer. The melody became clearer. It was beautiful. The voices seemed to come from everywhere. They were soft and sweet. They sounded almost like memories. Odysseus listened. The sirens sang of knowledge. They sang of distant lands. They sang of the great war at Troy. They seemed to know everything. They promised that Odysseus could hear secrets no other man had ever heard. They promised that he could learn the hidden stories of the world. Odysseus felt something inside him change. He wanted to hear more. He pulled against the ropes. He shouted to his men. He ordered them to release him. But the sailors could not hear. The wax protected them. They continued rowing. Odysseus struggled harder. The sirens continued singing. Their voices followed the ship. The island seemed to draw closer. The sailors looked only toward the sea ahead. They had been given one command: do not release him. So they obeyed. They rowed harder. The ship passed the island. Slowly, the voices became quieter. The melody faded. The sea became silent again. Only then did the sailors remove the wax from their ears. They looked toward Odysseus. He was exhausted, but he was alive. They untied him. Odysseus sat quietly upon the deck. For a long moment, he said nothing. He had survived the sirens. But another danger waited ahead. The sea began to change. The waters became narrower. High cliffs appeared on either side of the ship. The sailors realized that they were approaching a dangerous passage. Circe had warned Odysseus about this place. There were two terrible dangers. On one side lived Scylla. On the other was Charybdis. Scylla was a monstrous creature who lived among the rocks. Charybdis was a great whirlpool that could swallow ships. The passage between them was extremely narrow. There was no perfect route. A ship could not avoid both dangers. Odysseus understood the difficult choice. If they moved too close to Charybdis, the entire ship could be destroyed. If they moved toward the cliffs, Scylla could attack. The sailors waited for their captain's decision. Odysseus tried to remain calm. He knew fear would make things worse. The ship entered the narrow passage. The cliffs rose high above them. The sunlight disappeared beneath the shadows. The sea became darker. The sailors looked toward the water. Charybdis appeared. The sea began to move in a huge circular motion. Water disappeared into a deep whirlpool. Then it rose again. The sound was enormous. The sailors became frightened. They tried to row faster. Odysseus ordered them to keep moving. They could not stop. They had to pass through. But the cliffs were waiting on the other side. High above the ship, hidden among the rocks, was Scylla. She waited silently. The sailors could not see her clearly. Only shadows moved across the cliffs. Odysseus knew that she was there. He had been warned that Scylla would attack the ship. He had been told that several sailors would be taken. There was nothing he could do to prevent it. The ship moved closer. The water became increasingly violent. The sailors rowed with all their strength. Suddenly, movement appeared above them. Scylla reached down from the cliffs. The sailors shouted. The ship shook. Several men disappeared from the deck. The others could only continue rowing. Odysseus watched helplessly. He wanted to fight. He wanted to protect his men. But there was no enemy he could simply defeat with a sword. Scylla was beyond their reach. And stopping the ship would only bring greater danger. So they continued. The cliffs slowly fell behind them. The whirlpool disappeared. The sea widened again. The sailors were exhausted. Some of their companions were gone. The deck was quiet. Odysseus looked back toward the cliffs. He knew that he had lost men he could never replace. The sea continued moving. The ship sailed onward. For a long time, nobody spoke. The sailors had survived another danger. But survival did not always feel like victory. Sometimes it meant simply continuing. Sometimes it meant carrying the memory of those who had been lost. Odysseus stood at the front of the ship. The wind moved through his hair. The sun was beginning to descend. The cliffs behind them became smaller. The sea ahead opened once again. He thought about the sirens. Their beautiful voices had tried to make him forget his journey. He thought about Scylla. She had reminded him that some dangers could not be defeated. Between them was the lesson of the journey itself. Not every challenge could be solved through strength. Sometimes survival required discipline. Sometimes it required sacrifice. And sometimes it required accepting what could not be changed. Night approached. The sailors prepared the ship for darkness. The stars appeared above them. The sea became calm once again. The men rested quietly. Odysseus remained awake. He looked toward the horizon. He thought about Ithaca. The journey had become longer than he had ever imagined. Yet he still remembered home. He remembered the hills, the familiar shores, the palace, Penelope, Telemachus. Those memories remained stronger than the songs of the sirens. The sirens had promised knowledge. They had promised glory. They had promised secrets. But Odysseus had chosen to continue. Because none of those things were more important than returning home. The sea moved gently beneath the ship. The night was quiet. The stars seemed to stretch endlessly across the sky. Odysseus looked upward. Perhaps the same stars were visible from Ithaca. Perhaps Penelope could see them too. That thought gave him comfort. The sailors slept. The ship continued forward. Behind them lay the dangerous passage of Scylla and Charybdis. Ahead waited another island. Another chapter. Another test. The journey was not yet finished. But each danger they survived brought them one step farther from the places they had known and one step closer to home. The moon rose above the sea. Its reflection moved across the waves. Odysseus finally sat down. He listened to the water. The sound was gentle, almost like a whisper. The sea no longer seemed angry. For the moment, it allowed them to rest. And beneath the quiet stars, the ship continued its slow journey through the darkness. The voices of the sirens were gone. The cliffs of Scylla were behind them. The whirlpool of Charybdis had disappeared into the night. What remained was the sea, the wind, the stars, and the memory of Ithaca. Odysseus closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring another challenge. But tonight, for a little while, the sea was calm. And the journey continued beneath the endless sky. The ship sailed onward beneath a quiet sky. Behind Odysseus and his men lay the narrow passage of Scylla and Charybdis. The dangerous cliffs had slowly disappeared into the distance, leaving only the open sea before them. The sailors were exhausted. They had survived the Sirens. They had passed between the great whirlpool and the cliffs. They had watched companions disappear. Now they needed rest. For several days, the sea remained calm. The wind was gentle. The sun rose each morning over the horizon and followed its familiar path across the sky. The sailors repaired the ship and prepared food. They spoke quietly among themselves. Odysseus often stood at the front of the vessel, looking toward the horizon. He remembered the words of Tiresias. He remembered the warning. There was an island ahead. An island sacred to Aeolus, the god of the sun. Upon that island lived herds of cattle and sheep that belonged to Aeolus. They were not ordinary animals. They were sacred. Tiresias had warned Odysseus that his men must not harm them. Circe had given him the same warning. The animals were to be left alone. Odysseus had promised to remember. But the journey had already taken so much from the sailors. Their supplies were becoming smaller. Their strength was fading. And the sea was still between them and home. One afternoon, a dark shape appeared on the horizon. The sailors noticed it first. They called to Odysseus. "Land!" Odysseus looked carefully. It was an island. Green hills rose above the sea. The coastline appeared peaceful. The sunlight seemed unusually bright around it. As the ship approached, the sailors could hear birds calling from the shore. They could also see animals moving across the distant fields. Cattle. Many cattle. Their coats shone beneath the sunlight. Some were white. Others were golden brown. They moved slowly through the green grass. Odysseus immediately remembered the warning. He told his men that they must not touch the animals. They would remain near the shore. They would rest. But they would not hunt the sacred cattle. The sailors agreed. The ship entered a sheltered bay. They lowered the sails. They anchored near the coast. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. The island was beautiful. The grass was green. The trees moved gently in the wind. The hills rose softly beneath the clear sky. The cattle wandered freely. The sea around the island was calm. The sailors stepped onto the shore. They were tired and hungry. They had been traveling for a long time. Odysseus reminded them again. They could eat the food they still carried. They could fish from the sea. But the cattle belonged to Aeolus. They must not harm them. The men promised. That evening, they prepared a small meal near the ship. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The sky turned gold. Then orange. Then deep purple. The cattle remained in the fields. The sailors watched them quietly. The island became peaceful beneath the evening sky. Odysseus looked toward the sea. He had a feeling that they should leave. But the weather began to change. Clouds appeared. The wind became stronger. A storm was approaching. Odysseus knew they could not safely continue. They would have to remain on the island. He gathered his men. He told them to stay near the ship. He reminded them once again about the cattle. Then he went to sleep. The storm arrived during the night. Rain struck the sea. The wind shook the trees. Waves crashed against the shore. The sailors gathered near their shelter. They could do nothing except wait. Morning came. The storm had not ended. The sea remained rough. The ship was difficult to sail. For days, the sailors remained trapped on the island. Their food began to disappear. The supplies they had carried from Circe's island became smaller each day. The sailors began to grow worried. They looked at the cattle. The animals continued to wander through the fields. They were healthy. They were plentiful. And they were close. Hunger became stronger than patience. The men remembered Odysseus's warnings. They knew the cattle were sacred. But they were hungry. Some argued that the gods might understand. Others said that if they offered the best animals as sacrifices, perhaps Aeolus would forgive them. The situation became more difficult with every passing day. Odysseus warned them again. He told them not to touch the cattle. He reminded them of the prophecy. He reminded them of everything they had already survived. But the storm continued. The sailors became desperate. Eventually, Odysseus went away from the camp to pray. He asked the gods for help. He asked that the winds calm. He asked that the sea become safe again. But while he was gone, the sailors made their decision. They would slaughter the cattle. They chose the finest animals. The sacred cattle of Aeolus. They prepared them as food. They made a sacrifice. Smoke rose into the sky. The sailors hoped that the gods would accept their offering. But the act had already been committed. The animals were dead. When Odysseus returned, he immediately understood what had happened. He was horrified. He knew that they had broken the warning. There was nothing he could do to undo it. The sailors could only wait. The days passed. Eventually, the storm weakened. The clouds began to disappear. The sea became calmer. The sailors prepared the ship. They were eager to leave. Perhaps they believed that they had survived the worst. But the gods had not forgotten. Aeolus saw what had happened. He was furious. The sacred animals had been killed. Aeolus demanded justice. He appealed to Zeus. He asked that the sailors pay for what they had done. The fate of the ship was now decided. Odysseus and his men left the island. For a short time, the sea seemed calm. The ship moved smoothly across the water. The sailors began to relax. They thought they had escaped. But the sky changed. Clouds gathered. The wind grew stronger. The sea became dark. A storm appeared. It was unlike the storms they had known before. Thunder rolled across the sky. Lightning flashed above the water. The sailors struggled to control the ship. Odysseus shouted instructions. The men pulled at the ropes. They tried to keep the sails under control. But the storm was too powerful. The sea rose around them. The ship was lifted by enormous waves. Then came a terrible sound. The ship broke apart. Wooden pieces scattered across the water. The sailors were thrown into the sea. Odysseus held onto part of the wreckage. He looked around. The ship was gone. His companions were gone. The sea had swallowed everything. Odysseus floated alone. The storm continued around him. He had survived Troy. He had survived Polyphemus. He had survived the Sirens. He had survived Scylla and Charybdis. Now he was alone upon the sea. He remembered Ithaca. He remembered Penelope. He remembered Telemachus. Those memories gave him strength. The storm eventually weakened. The clouds moved away. The sea became quieter. Odysseus remained alone. He held onto the broken wood. The sun appeared through the clouds. Its light reflected across the water. The same sun that had watched the sacred cattle now illuminated the lonely sea. Odysseus continued drifting. He did not know where the current would take him. He did not know how long he would remain alone. But he continued. The island of the sun disappeared behind him. The green fields. The sacred cattle. The peaceful shore. All were gone. Only memory remained. Odysseus thought about the men who had been with him. They had made a terrible mistake. But they had also been tired. Hungry. Afraid. The journey had worn them down. Odysseus understood that the sea had tested them not only through monsters and storms. It had tested their patience, their discipline, their ability to remember why they were traveling. The island had looked peaceful. There had been no monster waiting in the forest. No giant standing at the entrance of a cave. No siren calling from the rocks. The danger had been much quieter. It had been hunger. And hunger had become temptation. The sun moved across the sky. Odysseus floated beneath it. The water around him was calm now. For the first time in many days, there was no ship. No sailors. No voices. Only the sea. He looked toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond it was Ithaca. He could not see it. But he remembered it. And memory was enough to keep him moving. Night eventually arrived. The stars appeared. Odysseus rested upon the broken piece of wood. The sea moved gently beneath him. He was alone. But he was still alive. The story of his journey had entered another stage. He no longer had his crew. He no longer had his ship. He had only himself. And the road ahead. The moon appeared above the water. Its light reflected across the waves. Odysseus closed his eyes. For a while, he listened to the sea. The gentle movement of the water almost sounded like a lullaby. He thought about home. He imagined the hills of Ithaca beneath the morning sun. He imagined walking upon its shores. He imagined hearing familiar voices. The thought brought him peace. The night passed slowly. When morning came, the sea was quiet. The horizon was bright. Odysseus opened his eyes. He saw something in the distance. Land. At first, he could not be certain. It was only a faint shape. But as the sunlight grew stronger, the shape became clearer. There was an island. Another island. Another unknown shore. Odysseus looked toward it. He did not know what awaited him there. But he had learned to continue even when he was afraid. He held on to the broken wood. The current slowly carried him toward the distant land. Behind him lay the island of the sun. Ahead waited another chapter. Another test. Another place between Odysseus and home. The sun rose higher. Its golden light spread across the sea. For a moment, the water looked peaceful and endless. Odysseus watched the horizon. He remembered the sacred cattle. He remembered the warnings. He remembered the consequences. Perhaps the journey had taught him that the greatest dangers were not always the ones that looked frightening. Sometimes they came quietly. Sometimes they arrived through hunger. Sometimes they appeared as a beautiful island where nothing seemed wrong. But Odysseus continued. The waves carried him onward. The island ahead slowly grew larger. And somewhere beyond all these distant shores, beyond storms and monsters and enchanted islands, Ithaca was still waiting. Home was still waiting. The journey was not over. And beneath the rising sun, Odysseus continued toward the unknown. The sea carried Odysseus onward. He had lost everything. His ship was gone. His companions were gone. Behind him lay the island of the sun, where hunger and disobedience had brought terrible consequences. Now there was only the open sea. Odysseus held tightly to a piece of wood from the broken ship. The waves lifted him and lowered him again. For many hours, he drifted without knowing where the current was taking him. The sun crossed the sky. Then evening came. The light slowly disappeared. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. There was no land. Only water. The night was long. He rested as best he could upon the wooden wreckage. The sea moved beneath him with a slow rhythm. He was exhausted. Yet somewhere inside him, the memory of Ithaca remained. He remembered Penelope. He remembered Telemachus. He remembered the hills and shores of his homeland. He had lost his ship. He had lost his crew. But he had not lost the desire to return. That desire kept him alive. When morning came, Odysseus opened his eyes. The sky was pale. The sea was calm. And in the distance, he saw land. At first it looked like a shadow. Then the shape became clearer. There were cliffs, green hills, trees, a narrow beach. Odysseus gathered what strength remained in him. The current slowly carried him toward the island. Eventually, he reached the shore. He stepped onto the sand. For a moment, he simply stood there. He was alive. After everything that had happened, he was alive. The island was beautiful. It was unlike the dark shores of the Underworld. It was unlike the dangerous cliffs of Scylla. It was unlike the stormy waters of the Island of the Sun. This place was peaceful. Tall trees grew along the hills. Flowers covered the ground. Birds moved through the branches. A small stream flowed from the forest toward the sea. The air was warm. The sunlight was gentle. Odysseus walked slowly into the island. He had no idea who lived there. He only knew that he needed shelter. He followed the sound of water. Soon he discovered a beautiful spring surrounded by trees. He drank. The water was cool. Then he rested beneath the shade. For the first time in many days, there was no storm. No monster. No dangerous sea. No angry god. Only silence. Odysseus closed his eyes. He slept. When he awoke, he heard music. It was soft and distant. A woman's voice. He followed the sound through the forest. Eventually, he reached a beautiful clearing. There stood a magnificent home. The house was surrounded by flowering trees. Vines covered the walls. Birds sang around the roof. The air was filled with the scent of flowers. A woman stood near the entrance. Her name was Calypso. She was a powerful and mysterious nymph who lived upon the island. Calypso saw the exhausted traveler. She approached him. She understood immediately that he had suffered greatly. She offered him food. She offered him water. She offered him a place to rest. Odysseus accepted. He was too tired to ask many questions. For several days, Calypso cared for him. She gave him fresh clothing. She prepared food. She showed him the island. There were beautiful gardens, quiet forests, clear streams, hidden caves. The coastline stretched beneath bright skies. The island seemed almost untouched by the troubles of the wider world. Odysseus slowly recovered. His wounds healed. His strength returned. He could walk again. He could eat normally. He could sleep peacefully. But there was one thing that did not disappear. His longing for Ithaca. Every morning, he looked toward the sea. Every evening, he stood near the shore. He watched the horizon. He imagined ships traveling across the distant water. He wondered whether one might carry him home. Calypso noticed. She understood that Odysseus was thinking about another place. She asked him why. Odysseus told her about Ithaca. He told her about his wife. He told her about his son. He told her about the home he had not seen for many years. Calypso listened. She knew that Odysseus wanted to leave. But she also knew that the island could offer him something else. He could remain. He could live there peacefully. He would never have to face the dangers of the sea again. The island had everything he needed. Food, water, shelter, beauty, peace, and Calypso herself. Yet Odysseus could not forget home. Years passed. The exact passage of time became difficult to measure. The seasons changed. Flowers appeared and disappeared. Trees changed beneath the weather. The moon rose and fell countless times. Odysseus remained on the island. Sometimes he walked through the forest. Sometimes he sat beside the sea. Sometimes he watched the sunset alone. Calypso continued to care for him. But happiness was difficult. A person can live in a beautiful place and still feel far from home. The island was peaceful. But peace was not enough. Odysseus wanted to see Ithaca. He wanted to know what had happened to Penelope. He wanted to see his son. He wanted to walk once again upon the land where he had grown up. The sea became a symbol of both freedom and separation. Every time Odysseus looked at it, he remembered the journey. He remembered the ships that had carried him. He remembered the men who had sailed beside him. He remembered all the islands, all the storms, all the losses. And beyond all of them was Ithaca. One evening, Odysseus sat alone on the shore. The sun was setting. The sky was filled with soft gold and orange. The sea reflected the fading light. Calypso approached him. She asked why he continued to sit there. Odysseus told her that he missed his home. He said that no matter how beautiful the island was, it could not become Ithaca. Calypso understood. She knew that Odysseus's heart belonged somewhere else. But the gods had not yet decided his fate. Odysseus remained. The years continued. Meanwhile, far away on Mount Olympus, the gods remembered him. Athena, who had always favored Odysseus, spoke on his behalf. She asked Zeus to allow the hero to return home. Zeus listened. The decision was made. Odysseus had suffered enough. He would be allowed to leave Calypso's island. Hermes was sent to deliver the message. He traveled across the sea and eventually reached the island. Calypso understood that the decision had been made. Odysseus would leave. She was not pleased. But she could not oppose the will of the gods. She told Odysseus that he was finally free to go. For the first time in years, the possibility of home became real. Odysseus immediately began preparing. He needed to build a new raft. There was no ship waiting for him. There were no sailors. There was no crew. He would have to cross the sea alone. Calypso helped him. She provided tools. She provided wood. She provided food and water for the journey. Odysseus worked carefully. He cut the timber. He tied the pieces together. He built a strong raft. Day after day, he worked. The sound of tools echoed through the forest. The raft slowly took shape. Eventually, it was ready. Odysseus stood beside it and looked toward the sea. He knew that another journey was beginning. He was leaving behind a place where he had spent many years. The island had protected him. It had given him shelter when he had nothing. It had helped him recover. Yet it had also kept him far from home. On the morning of his departure, the island was quiet. The sky was clear. The sea was calm. Birds moved through the trees. Odysseus prepared the raft. Calypso stood nearby. She wished him a safe journey. Odysseus thanked her. Then he pushed the raft into the water. He climbed aboard. The wind filled the small sail. Slowly, the raft moved away from the shore. Odysseus looked back. The green island became smaller. The forest disappeared into the distance. Calypso remained on the beach. For a moment, Odysseus felt sadness. The island had been his home for many years. Leaving it was not easy. But he knew where he needed to go. Forward. Toward Ithaca. The sea stretched endlessly ahead. Odysseus held the steering oar. The raft rose gently over the waves. For several days, the weather remained calm. He watched the stars at night. He used them to guide his direction. During the day, he followed the sun. He ate the food Calypso had given him. He drank the water she had prepared. The sea was vast. But Odysseus was no longer afraid of distance. He had crossed greater seas before. He had survived storms. He had entered the underworld. He had faced monsters. He had lost everything and continued. Now he had only one goal. Home. But the sea had not finished testing him. One day, clouds began to appear. At first, they were small and distant. Then they grew larger. The wind changed. The waves became stronger. Odysseus looked toward the sky. A storm was coming. He tightened his grip on the raft. The sea rose beneath him. The peaceful journey suddenly became dangerous. Rain began to fall. Wind pushed against the sail. The raft moved violently across the water. Odysseus struggled to maintain control. He had no crew. No strong ship. No shelter. Only the small raft beneath him. The storm continued through the night. Lightning flashed across the sky. Thunder rolled over the sea. Odysseus held on. He remembered everything he had already survived. He would not give up now. Eventually, the storm began to weaken. The clouds slowly separated. The sea became calmer. Morning light appeared. Odysseus looked toward the horizon. There was land. A distant coastline. He had survived again. The raft continued toward it. Odysseus did not know what awaited him. He did not know whether the land was friendly. He did not know whether another danger was waiting. But he knew one thing. He was closer to Ithaca than he had been for many years. The sun rose higher. The sea became golden. Odysseus watched the distant shore. His journey had begun at Troy. It had taken him across countless seas. He had visited islands of forgetfulness. He had faced giants. He had encountered enchantresses. He had entered the world of the dead. He had heard the sirens. He had passed Scylla. He had survived the island of the sun. And now he had left Calypso's island. Each chapter had taken something from him. But each had also brought him closer to understanding what he truly wanted. Not glory. Not treasure. Not immortality. Home. As the raft approached the shore, Odysseus felt something he had not felt for a long time. Hope. The coastline grew larger. Green hills appeared beyond the beach. The sound of waves reached him. Odysseus guided the raft toward the land. At last, his long isolation was ending. He stepped onto the shore. He looked back toward the sea. The raft floated quietly behind him. Then he turned toward the land. He did not yet know that his return to Ithaca would bring another difficult chapter. There were men waiting in his home. There were challenges still ahead. But the most distant part of his journey was almost over. The sea that had separated him from Ithaca had finally carried him toward it. Odysseus walked slowly along the shore. The morning sun illuminated the land. The wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time in many years, the road home was no longer a distant dream. It was beneath his feet. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the roads and forests, beyond the familiar coastline, waited the island he had never stopped remembering. Ithaca. His home. His family. His past. And perhaps, at last, his future. The shore was quiet. Odysseus stood upon the unfamiliar land and looked toward the hills beyond the beach. After so many years at sea, the sight of solid ground beneath his feet felt almost strange. He had left Troy with ships and companions. Now he had arrived alone. Behind him was the endless sea. Ahead was a land he did not yet recognize. But somehow, something about it felt familiar. The air was gentle. The hills were green. Olive trees grew upon the slopes. The coastline curved around a quiet bay. Odysseus walked slowly along the shore. He wondered where the sea had carried him. He wondered whether this could truly be Ithaca. For years, Ithaca had existed in his imagination. It had been a distant idea. A memory. A place he dreamed about whenever the sea became dark. Now the possibility was standing before him. Yet Odysseus could not be certain. He had learned during his journey that appearances could be misleading. Beautiful islands could hide dangers. Quiet shores could lead to strange encounters. So he remained cautious. He climbed a small hill above the beach. From there, he could see farther across the landscape. There were mountains in the distance, forests, fields, and a familiar shape upon the horizon. Odysseus stopped. He knew those hills. He knew the coastline. His heart began to beat faster. It was Ithaca. After 20 years, Odysseus had finally returned. But his return was not the joyful moment he had imagined. There was no crowd waiting on the beach. No musicians. No celebration. No familiar voices calling his name. He was alone. And there was a reason for this. Athena had told him that his home had changed. Many men had gathered inside his palace. They were called the suitors. They wanted to marry Penelope. They believed Odysseus was dead. They had taken over his home. They ate his food. They drank his wine. They used his possessions. They waited for Penelope to choose one of them. Odysseus could not simply walk into his palace. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to know who remained loyal to him. He needed to discover whether his family was safe. So Athena appeared before him. The goddess had protected Odysseus throughout much of his journey. Now she would help him return. She told him that he must be patient. He could not reveal his identity immediately. The situation in Ithaca was dangerous. The suitors were powerful. If they discovered that Odysseus had returned, they might try to kill him. So Athena disguised him. His appearance changed. Instead of looking like a powerful king, he appeared as an old and poor traveler. His clothing became simple. His face looked older. His body appeared tired. Anyone who saw him would think he was only a wandering stranger. Odysseus accepted the disguise. It was difficult. After everything he had survived, he had finally reached his home. Yet he could not enter it as himself. He could only wait. Athena told him where he should go. There was a loyal swineherd named Eumaeus. He lived outside the palace. Eumaeus had remained faithful to Odysseus. Even after all those years, he still remembered his king. Odysseus traveled toward his home. The roads were familiar. He passed through the countryside. He saw olive trees. He saw fields. He saw the hills he had remembered for so long. Every step brought memories back. He remembered his childhood. He remembered the palace. He remembered his parents. He remembered the days before the war. The journey had changed him. He was no longer the same young king who had sailed toward Troy. He had become older. more patient, more cautious. He had lost friends. He had experienced suffering. But beneath everything, he was still Odysseus. Still the man who wanted to return home. Eventually, he reached the home of Eumaeus. The swineherd saw the old stranger approaching. He did not recognize him, but he welcomed him. Eumaeus offered food. He offered shelter. He spoke kindly to the traveler. Odysseus listened. He wanted to know what had happened in Ithaca. Eumaeus began to speak about his king. He said that Odysseus had been gone for many years. He believed that his king was still alive somewhere. Perhaps he was trapped upon a distant island. Perhaps he had died. No one knew. Eumaeus spoke with sadness. He explained that Penelope had remained faithful. She continued to wait. She had refused to forget Odysseus. But the suitors had made her life difficult. They came to the palace every day. They consumed the household's food. They demanded that she choose one of them. Odysseus listened quietly. Inside, he felt anger. But he did not reveal it. He knew that patience was necessary. That evening, Odysseus remained with Eumaeus. They sat together near the fire. The night was cool. The stars appeared above the countryside. For the first time in many years, Odysseus was sleeping upon the land of Ithaca. But he was not yet home. The next day, another important moment arrived. Telemachus returned. Odysseus's son had grown into a young man during his father's absence. When Odysseus had left for Troy, Telemachus had been very young. Now he was old enough to understand what had happened. He had spent much of his life without his father. Odysseus watched him approach. For a moment, he could hardly believe what he saw. This was his son. The child he had left behind. Now he was a grown man. Athena removed Odysseus's disguise. Telemachus stared at him. At first, he did not understand. Then he realized. His father had returned. Odysseus and Telemachus stood before each other. For years, they had existed only in each other's memories. Now they were together. They embraced. Neither spoke for a while. There were too many years between them. Too many things that could not be explained in a single conversation. Odysseus told Telemachus about his journey. He spoke of Troy, the Cyclops, the Sirens, the Underworld, Calypso's island, the storms, the loss of his crew. Telemachus listened. Then they began to speak about Ithaca. They discussed the suitors. They discussed Penelope. They needed a plan. Odysseus could not enter the palace openly. They needed to surprise the suitors. They needed to recover their home carefully. Telemachus agreed. The father and son began preparing. Odysseus would enter the palace disguised as a beggar. Telemachus would follow. Together, they would observe the situation. They would wait. Patience would be their greatest weapon. The following morning, Odysseus traveled toward the palace. As he approached, memories became stronger. He could see the walls, the gates, the familiar courtyard. This was the home he had dreamed about for years. Yet when he entered, he saw strangers. The suitors filled the great hall. They were eating, drinking, laughing. They behaved as though the palace belonged to them. Odysseus watched silently. No one recognized him. One of the suitors noticed the old traveler. He mocked him. Another laughed. Odysseus remained calm. He had faced much worse than insults. He had stood before giants. He had survived storms. He had entered the underworld. A few rude words could not break his patience. Then Odysseus saw Penelope. She entered the hall. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. It had been many years. Yet he recognized her immediately. She had changed. She had grown older. But she was still Penelope, his wife, the woman he had remembered throughout his journey. Odysseus wanted to reveal himself. He wanted to speak her name. He wanted to tell her that he had finally returned. But he could not. He had to remain disguised. Penelope looked at the old stranger. She did not know who he was. Yet there was something about him that felt unusual. She asked him where he came from. Odysseus told her a carefully prepared story. He said that he had traveled through distant lands. He spoke about Odysseus. He told her that he had once met him. Penelope listened closely. She wanted to know whether her husband was still alive. Odysseus told her that he believed Odysseus was alive. Penelope became emotional. For years, she had lived with uncertainty. She did not know whether to hope. She did not know whether to mourn. But hearing that her husband might still be alive gave her a small sense of comfort. Odysseus watched her carefully. He could not tell her the truth yet. The moment had not arrived. That night, he remained in the palace. He slept among the servants. The home he had once ruled now felt unfamiliar. But beneath the changes, it was still his home. He could hear the sea outside. He could hear the wind moving through the trees. He could smell the familiar earth of Ithaca. For the first time in 20 years, Odysseus was sleeping beneath his own roof. But his journey was not yet complete. The suitors remained. The palace remained under their control. Penelope remained surrounded by uncertainty. Odysseus knew that one final challenge awaited him. The next morning, Penelope announced a contest. She brought out Odysseus's great bow. It had belonged to him. The bow was difficult to use. Only Odysseus had been able to string it properly. Penelope declared that she would marry the man who could string the bow and shoot an arrow through a series of axes. The suitors accepted the challenge. One after another, they tried. One after another, they failed. They could not even string the bow. Odysseus watched. Then he stepped forward. The suitors laughed. They did not believe that an old beggar could succeed where they had failed. But Odysseus took the bow. He held it calmly. He knew its weight. He knew its shape. He had used it many times before. With one smooth movement, he strung it. The hall became silent. The suitors stared. Odysseus lifted the bow. He drew the string. Then released the arrow. It passed perfectly through the targets. For a moment, no one moved. Then Odysseus revealed himself. He was no longer the old traveler. He was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man who had been absent for 20 years. The suitors finally understood. The stranger they had mocked was the king they believed dead. The great hall changed instantly. Odysseus stood with Telemachus beside him. The final struggle for his home had begun. But the long journey was finally coming to an end. Odysseus had crossed oceans. He had faced gods and monsters. He had lost friends. He had survived the darkest places. And now he stood inside his own home. Ithaca was no longer a distant dream. It was real. It was beneath his feet. Outside, the sea moved quietly. The same sea that had carried him away from Troy had finally brought him back. Odysseus looked toward the doorway. Beyond it were the green hills of Ithaca. The familiar coastline. The olive trees. The sky. His home. He had spent years searching for this moment. Now it had arrived. But there was still one final thing he wanted. He wanted peace. He wanted to see Penelope again. He wanted his family to live without fear. He wanted the palace to become a home once more. The long journey had taught him that returning home was not simply about reaching a shore. It was about recovering the life that had been waiting there. And so, after 20 years, Odysseus stood again in Ithaca. The wanderer had finally returned. The sea was behind him. The road was ending. The great hall of Ithaca was silent. For a moment, no one moved. Odysseus stood in the center of the palace with his bow in his hands. The disguise of the old traveler was no longer important. The years of wandering were visible in his face, but beneath them stood the same man who had once ruled Ithaca. Odysseus had returned. Telemachus stood nearby. Penelope watched from the other side of the hall. She had heard the stories. She had heard the stranger speak about Odysseus. She had heard that he might still be alive. But now she was looking at a man who claimed to be her husband. After 20 years, how could she know? The years had changed them both. When Odysseus left for Troy, Penelope had been a young woman. Now she was older. Her hair was different. Her face carried the quiet marks of years spent waiting. Odysseus had changed too. His journey had left its own marks. He had crossed dangerous seas. He had lived among strangers. He had survived storms and monsters. He had spent years away from his family. Could two people who had been separated for so long simply recognize one another? Penelope did not rush toward him. She remained cautious. She had lived with uncertainty for too long. For years, men had told her that Odysseus was probably dead. Other men had come to her palace. They had asked her to marry them. They had promised her wealth and protection. They had told her that she could not wait forever. But Penelope had continued to wait. She had found a way to delay them. She had told the suitors that she would choose a husband after completing a piece of weaving. Every day, she worked on a large cloth. Every night, when no one was watching, she secretly undid part of what she had woven. The work continued. Day after day. Night after night. It became a quiet symbol of her patience. She was waiting for Odysseus. Perhaps she believed he would return. Perhaps she simply could not accept that he was gone. But she refused to give up. The suitors became impatient. They wanted an answer. They wanted Penelope to choose one of them. They had grown comfortable in Odysseus's palace. They ate his food. They drank his wine. They used his household as though it belonged to them. They had forgotten what it meant to respect the home of another man. Telemachus had watched this for years. He had grown up surrounded by men who treated his father's palace as their own. He had learned to remain quiet. But he had also grown stronger. Now his father stood beside him. The balance had changed. Odysseus looked around the hall. He recognized the arrogance of the suitors. Some had laughed at him earlier. Some had insulted him. None had imagined that the old traveler was actually the king of Ithaca. Now they understood. Their confidence disappeared. The hall became tense. Outside, the wind moved through the olive trees. The sea could be heard in the distance. For Odysseus, the sound was familiar. He had spent 20 years listening to the sea. But now he was standing on the other side of it. He was home. Yet home was not peaceful. The suitors had taken control of his household. They had treated Penelope unfairly. They had ignored Telemachus. They had consumed the wealth of Ithaca. Odysseus had returned to find his own house almost unrecognizable. Still, Penelope remained cautious. She wanted to know whether the man before her was truly Odysseus. There had been too many false stories. Too many travelers had arrived claiming to know something about her husband. She had learned not to trust easily. So she decided to test him. Penelope asked the servants to prepare a bed for the stranger. Odysseus immediately reacted. He knew that their bed could not simply be moved. It had been built around the trunk of an olive tree. The bed was part of the house itself. He had made it. He knew its details. When Penelope mentioned moving it, Odysseus became surprised. He explained how the bed had been constructed. He described the olive tree. He described the room. He remembered everything. Penelope finally understood. This was not a stranger. This was her husband. Odysseus. The man she had waited for. The man she had thought about for 20 years. The man who had disappeared into the world and somehow found his way home. Penelope approached him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then they embraced. The years between them seemed to disappear. They had both lived through different kinds of loneliness. Odysseus had been alone upon distant islands. Penelope had been alone inside her own home. He had faced storms and monsters. She had faced uncertainty and pressure. He had traveled across the world. She had remained in Ithaca. Yet both had been waiting. The reunion was quiet. It did not need grand words. Their presence together was enough. That night, Odysseus told Penelope about his journey. He spoke about Troy. He spoke about the Cyclops. He told her about the island of the Lotus-Eaters. He described Circe. He spoke about the Underworld. He remembered the Sirens. He told her about the terrible waters of Scylla and Charybdis. He spoke of the island of the sun. He told her how he had lost his crew. He described Calypso's island. Penelope listened. Some stories were difficult to believe. But she knew that the man telling them was the same man she had waited for. Every chapter of his journey had brought him closer to Ithaca. And now the journey was almost complete. Outside the palace, however, the consequences of the suitors' actions remained. Odysseus could not simply forget what had happened. They had dishonored his home. They had threatened his family. They had consumed his wealth. They had believed that he would never return. Now they had to face the consequences. Telemachus stood beside his father. For the first time in his life, he was no longer simply the son of an absent king. He stood beside Odysseus as a grown man. The two of them had become partners. Father and son. King and heir. Together, they could restore the household. But Odysseus knew that revenge alone would not restore Ithaca. The palace had been damaged not only by the behavior of the suitors. It had been damaged by years of absence. The people of Ithaca had lived without their king. The household had lived without its master. The island had changed. Odysseus would have to learn how to live there again. He had spent 20 years dreaming of Ithaca. Now he needed to become part of it again. The next morning, the palace felt different. The servants knew that Odysseus had returned. Some had remained loyal to him. Others had forgotten him. There were people who remembered the young king who had left for Troy. Now they saw an older man standing in his place. Odysseus walked through the palace slowly. He touched the walls. He looked at the rooms. He remembered his childhood. He remembered Penelope. He remembered Telemachus as a small child. The palace was filled with memories. But memories were not enough. A home was not only made of walls. It was made of people. Penelope understood this. She had protected the household during Odysseus's absence. She had kept his memory alive. She had protected Telemachus. She had resisted the pressure of the suitors. Her patience had been one of the reasons Odysseus could return to something that still resembled home. Odysseus looked at her differently now. He understood that his journey had not been the only difficult one. Penelope had her own journey. It simply did not cross the sea. Her journey had been one of waiting. Every morning, she had wondered whether Odysseus was alive. Every evening, she had looked toward the horizon. She had listened to rumors. She had heard stories of ships returning from distant lands. She had waited through years when hope became difficult. And still she waited. The Odyssey was therefore not only the story of a man trying to return home. It was also the story of the people who remained behind. Penelope had kept a place for Odysseus. Telemachus had grown up wondering about his father. Eumaeus had remained loyal. Others had remembered the king. The return of Odysseus brought all these stories together. The palace became quiet that evening. The sun began to set over Ithaca. Golden light entered through the windows. The sea beyond the palace reflected the fading sky. Odysseus stood beside Penelope. For the first time in many years, they watched the sunset together. Neither needed to speak. They had already said enough. The world outside the palace was still uncertain. There were still consequences to face. There were still people who had to understand that Odysseus had returned. But inside the palace, something had been restored. A family had been reunited. A husband had found his wife. A father had found his son. A king had returned to his home. The years of waiting were finally over. Penelope looked toward the sea. She knew that Odysseus had spent most of his life traveling. Perhaps some part of him would always belong to the sea. But now he had something the sea could never give him. A place to return to. A family. A home. Ithaca. The night grew darker. The stars appeared above the island. Odysseus remembered the stars he had watched during his years at sea. Once, they had been his guides. Now they were simply lights above his home. That difference seemed important. For so long, every star had pointed toward somewhere else. Now he had nowhere else to go. His journey was ending. Penelope remained beside him. Telemachus was nearby. The palace was quiet. The sea moved gently beyond the hills. And for the first time in 20 years, Odysseus could allow himself to rest. The Odyssey had begun with a man leaving his home. It had continued through war, storms, islands, gods and monsters. It had carried him farther than he could ever have imagined. But the heart of the story had always been simple. He wanted to return. He wanted to see Ithaca again. He wanted to see Penelope. He wanted to know his son. He wanted to belong somewhere. Now he had returned. Penelope's waiting had ended. Telemachus's uncertainty had ended. The palace was his again. The sea was behind him. The road ahead was no longer a road of wandering. It was a road of rebuilding. And as the quiet night settled over Ithaca, Odysseus and Penelope remained together beneath the stars. After 20 years, there was finally no distance between them. Only home. Only silence. Only the peaceful island of Ithaca beneath the night sky. The night over Ithaca was quiet. For the first time in 20 years, Odysseus was home. The sea that had carried him across distant lands was now behind him. The palace stood around him. The hills of Ithaca rose beyond the windows. The olive trees moved gently in the night breeze. And beside him was Penelope. For many years, Odysseus had imagined this moment. Sometimes he had imagined walking through the palace gates. Sometimes he had imagined seeing Penelope waiting for him. Sometimes he had imagined holding his son. But reality was different from imagination. There were no songs. No great celebration. No bright banners covering the palace. There was only quiet. A quiet that seemed to belong to the island itself. Odysseus sat beside Penelope. Neither of them spoke for a while. There were too many memories between them. 20 years was a long time. When Odysseus had left Ithaca, Telemachus had been a small child. Penelope had been waiting for her husband. The palace had been full of familiar voices. Then Odysseus had sailed away. The years that followed had changed everything. The Trojan War had lasted for years. Then the journey home had begun. But the journey had not taken days. It had taken years. Odysseus had traveled through strange lands. He had met people who had never heard of Ithaca. He had sailed beneath unfamiliar stars. He had seen islands that seemed to belong to another world. He had entered the cave of Polyphemus. He had visited the land of the Lotus-Eaters. He had known the magic of Circe. He had descended into the Underworld. He had heard the sirens singing across the sea. He had passed between Scylla and Charybdis. He had watched his companions make a terrible mistake on the island of the sun. He had spent years upon Calypso's island. Through all of it, one thought remained. Ithaca. Home. Now that word had become real again. Odysseus walked through the palace. He moved slowly. He looked at the old wooden doors. He touched the stone walls. He remembered rooms from his childhood. Some things had changed. Others had remained exactly as he remembered them. The palace carried the marks of time. But it was still his home. Outside, the first light of morning began to appear. The darkness slowly faded from the hills. Birds began to sing. The sea reflected the pale colors of dawn. Odysseus stepped outside. He stood on the terrace and looked across Ithaca. The island was beautiful. Green hills rolled toward the sea. Olive trees covered the slopes. Small paths crossed the countryside. Far away, the mountains rose beneath the morning sky. Odysseus breathed deeply. The air smelled familiar. For 20 years, he had carried the memory of this place inside him. Now he could smell its earth. He could feel its wind. He could hear its birds. He was no longer imagining Ithaca. He was standing upon it. Penelope joined him. She stood quietly beside him. Together, they watched the sunrise. Neither needed to say anything. They had both waited long enough. The sun rose above the hills. Golden light spread across the island. It illuminated the palace, the fields, the olive trees, the sea. For Odysseus, the sunrise felt like a beginning. Not the beginning of another journey, but the beginning of a life after the journey. For so long, every morning had meant another day of wandering. Another unknown shore. Another uncertain horizon. Now morning meant something different. It meant home. Telemachus soon joined them. He stood beside his parents. Odysseus looked at his son. He thought about the years he had missed. He had not watched Telemachus grow. He had not seen his first steps. He had not heard his first words. He had not guided him through childhood. Those years could never be recovered. But there was still a future. And perhaps that was enough. Odysseus placed a hand upon his son's shoulder. Telemachus smiled. They stood together beneath the morning sun. Father and son. King and heir. Two people who had finally found one another. The palace slowly became active. Servants moved through the halls. Fires were lit. Food was prepared. The sounds of ordinary life returned. For years, the palace had been dominated by the suitors. Their voices, their laughter, their demands. Now that noise was gone. The house felt different. It was quieter. But it was also alive. Penelope walked through the rooms. She saw familiar objects that had belonged to Odysseus. She remembered the day he had left. She remembered the promises they had made. At the time, neither of them could have known what the future would bring. She had expected him to return sooner. Perhaps after the war. Perhaps after a year. Then another year passed. Then another. Eventually, waiting became part of her life. She had learned patience. She had learned silence. She had learned how to protect her household. She had learned that hope could survive even when certainty disappeared. Now she no longer needed to wait. Odysseus was there. She could hear his voice. She could see him. She could reach for his hand. The waiting had ended. Later that morning, Odysseus walked toward the shore. He wanted to see the sea. He had spent so much of his life upon it. The sea had been his greatest obstacle. But it had also been his road home. He stood on the beach and watched the waves. They moved gently across the sand. There was no storm. No dangerous current. No distant monster. Only water. Odysseus remembered the night he had first left Ithaca. He remembered the ship, the sailors, the excitement of the journey. He had believed that the war would be difficult, but that eventually he would return. He had not known that the road home would become the greatest journey of his life. He thought about the men who had sailed with him. Many had never returned. Some had died in strange lands. Some had been lost to the sea. Some had made choices that brought disaster upon themselves. Odysseus remembered them. The beach was quiet. He allowed himself to think about those who were no longer there. Then he looked back toward Ithaca. The palace stood beyond the hills. Penelope was there. Telemachus was there. His home was there. The journey had taken much from him. But it had also taught him something. Home was not simply a place. It was a collection of memories. People. Promises. The feeling of belonging. Odysseus had seen beautiful islands. He had lived in places where the weather was warmer. He had visited lands richer than Ithaca. He had been offered comfort. He had even been offered a life without aging. But none of those places had been home. Ithaca was not important because it was the greatest island. It was important because it was his. It was where his story had begun. And it was where he wanted it to continue. The day passed peacefully. Odysseus spent time with Penelope and Telemachus. They spoke about the future. There would be work to do. The kingdom needed attention. The palace needed to be restored. The people needed reassurance. Life could not simply return to the way it had been 20 years earlier. Too much had changed. Odysseus had changed. Penelope had changed. Telemachus had grown into a man. Ithaca had changed. But perhaps that was not a problem. Home did not need to remain exactly as it had been. It only needed to remain meaningful. As evening approached, Odysseus and Penelope walked through the palace gardens. The air was warm. Flowers moved gently in the breeze. Birds flew between the trees. The sun began to sink toward the sea. The sky turned golden. Then orange. Then soft purple. Penelope looked at Odysseus. She asked him whether he ever regretted leaving. Odysseus thought about the question. He remembered Troy. He remembered the years of wandering. He remembered the men he had lost. He remembered the suffering. But he also remembered that he had no choice. The war had happened. The journey had happened. The past could not be changed. What mattered now was that he had returned. He told Penelope that the journey had taught him to value what he once took for granted. A quiet morning. A familiar road. A meal shared with family. A simple home. The sound of someone he loved nearby. These things had become precious because he had spent so many years without them. Penelope smiled. She understood. They continued walking. The garden became darker. The first stars appeared above Ithaca. Odysseus looked toward them. He had once used the stars to guide his ship across unknown seas. Now they were simply shining above his home. He no longer needed them to tell him where to go. He had arrived. That night, the family gathered together. There was food on the table. There was conversation. There was laughter. Nothing extraordinary happened. And that was what made it beautiful. After 20 years of extraordinary events, Odysseus finally experienced an ordinary evening. He ate with his family. He listened to familiar voices. He watched the fire. He looked around the room. There was no storm. No monster. No strange island. No prophecy. No distant horizon demanding that he continue. There was only home. The fire slowly burned lower. The night grew quieter. Eventually, everyone rested. Odysseus stood for a moment beside the open doorway. He looked outside. The moon illuminated the hills. The sea was calm. A gentle breeze moved through the olive trees. He remembered the first time he had dreamed of returning. He remembered sitting alone on distant shores. He remembered staring at the horizon and wondering whether he would ever see Ithaca again. Those memories seemed far away now. He had spent years believing that home was somewhere beyond the next horizon. But home had never stopped waiting for him. Penelope appeared beside him. She took his hand. Together they looked toward the quiet island. There was nothing more they needed to say. The story of Odysseus had begun with departure. It had passed through war. Then through wandering. Then through darkness. Then through loss. And finally, it had reached home. The sea had tested him. The gods had tested him. The monsters had tested him. But perhaps the greatest test had always been his ability to remember what he was trying to reach. He had remembered. He had continued. And he had returned. The night deepened over Ithaca. The stars filled the sky. The waves whispered softly along the shore. Inside the palace, Odysseus was finally at rest. Penelope was beside him. Telemachus was home. The kingdom had its king again. And the long road that had begun at Troy had finally ended. Not with a great battle. Not with a loud celebration. But with something much quieter. A man standing beneath the stars. A family reunited. An island resting beneath the night sky. And the simple knowledge that, after 20 years of wandering, Odysseus was finally home. The Odyssey had reached its end. The sea could continue moving beyond the horizon. Ships could continue crossing its waters. The stars could continue shining above distant lands. But Odysseus no longer needed to follow them. His journey was over. Ithaca was beneath his feet. Penelope was beside him. His son was near. The house was quiet. The night was peaceful. And for the first time in many years, there was nowhere else to go. Only home. Only Ithaca. Only rest.